Abraham moved south to Negev and lived for a while between Kadesh and Shur, and then he moved on to Gerar. While living there as a foreigner, Abraham introduced his wife Sarah by saying, "She is my sister." So King Abimelech of Gerar sent for Sarah and had her brought to him at his palace. But that night God came to Abimelech in a dream and told him, "You are a dead man, for that woman you have taken is already married." But Abimelech had not slept with her yet, so he said, "Lord, will you destroy an innocent nation? Didn't Abraham tell me she is my sister?" And she herself said, "Yes, he is my brother. I acted in complete innocence. My hands are clean." In the dream, God responded, "Yes, I know you are innocent. That's why I kept you from sinning against me and why I did not let you touch her. Now return the woman to her husband, and he will pray for you, for he is a prophet. Then you will live. But if you don't return her to him, you can be sure that you and all your people will die." Abimelech got up early the next morning and quickly called all his servants together. When he had told them what had happened, his men were terrified. Then Abimelech called for Abraham. "What have you done to us?" he demanded. "What crime have I committed that deserves treatment like this, making me and my kingdom guilty of this great sin? No one should ever do what you have done. Whatever possessed you to do such a thing?" Abraham replied, "I thought, this is a godless place. They will want my wife and will kill me to get her. And she really is my sister, for we both have the same father but different mothers, and I married her. Then God called me to leave my father's home and to travel from place to place. I told her, 'Do me a favor. Wherever we go, tell the people that I am your brother.' Then Abimelech took some of his sheep and goats, cattle, and male and female servants, and he presented them to Abraham. He also returned his wife Sarah to him. Then Abimelech said, 'Look over my land and choose any place where you would like to live.' And he said to Sarah, 'Look, I am giving your brother 1,000 pieces of silver in the presence of all these witnesses. This is to compensate for any wrong I may have done to you. This will settle any claim against me, and your reputation is cleared.' Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female servants, so they could have children. For the Lord had caused all the women to be infertile because of what happened with Abraham's wife, Sarah."
Thanks so much, Holly. The other day, I was at the Y, and I grabbed a basketball, and I went to my money spot, which is just inside the three-point ring, a little to the right of the lane. And I squared up, and I lobbed in a shot, air ball. And that was my money spot. So I decided to do some shuttle runs. And perhaps you guys remember those from your sports career or elementary school PE. Called wind sprints because they wind you, or suicides because they make you feel like you're going to die, or bleep tests because they make you want to cuss. We called them bleep tests because that's the sound that Mr. McClintock's little machine made in 4th grade on increasingly short intervals as we ran between the lines during the physical fitness test each year. Intervals for athletes, metronomes for musicians. Whatever your discipline, humans as a species have discovered that deliberately marking time has a positive way of forming us. It's no different in our apprenticeship to Jesus. 1 day in 7 to pray and to play and to celebrate the resurrection, and from which to launch into the other 6 days, rested and reformed. Or on a larger scale, the church calendar gives us Lent and Epiphany and Advent and these other seasons of the ancient church calendar that bring us around and around again and again to the central actions and acts of our faith in ways that are meant to form us. Advent begins this Sunday, and it runs through Christmas for the next 4 Sundays. You might not be familiar with Advent. I didn't grow up celebrating Advent. It's one of the many gifts that Jill brought into our marriage. Advent, if you haven't grown up with this tradition, here's a corny way to remember it. Remember when you were a kid and your parents were teaching you how to cross the street? They said, stop, wait, look both ways. That's what we do in Advent. We stop the sort of clutter that is even ramped up at this time of year, and we enter a season of waiting. And while we are waiting, we look backwards to our mothers and fathers in our family of faith. The people of God who lived before Jesus, who waited and longed for the rescuer whom God had promised he would send. We look backwards and imaginatively wait alongside them, and we wait and look forward, cultivating our own sense of longing for the return of the rescuer, for him to finish what he started, for him to complete making all things new. The rescuer has come. He will come again, and our hope is hinged to those two comings. Coming, that's what Advent means. In this season, we stop, we wait, we look both ways. We shape our hearts in longing for his return. That's what we're doing. This Sunday, we begin a short 4-part series, and here's the way we're going to handle it. You know those lists of names that you just skip over when you get to them in the Bible? You're like, you watch me read the Bible? No, I skip over them too. We're going to go to one of those lists. It's the list that Matthew puts right at the beginning of his telling of the life of Jesus. And I think he puts it there because Matthew, when he's telling us the life of Jesus, he understands that we will appreciate Jesus more, we'll celebrate Jesus better, we'll long for his return more if we understand his people, the people he comes from. So for the next 4 Sundays, each Sunday we're going to pluck a name out of that list. In fact, here's the first 4 verses of that list, just to give you a flavor. Don't worry, I'm not going to read all 17 verses of the list each week, but here's how it starts. This is a record of the ancestors of Jesus the Messiah, a descendant of David and of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac was the father of Jacob. Jacob was the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah, whose mother was Tamar. Perez was the father of Hezron, and I'll save you. But each week we're going to take one of these names. Some might be familiar to you, others might be less familiar, and we're going to go back and glimpse a vignette in the life of those names with this goal in mind. We want to see the first signs of the goodness of Jesus in his ancestors in a way that helps us to develop a taste for Jesus, a hunger for Jesus, so that we appreciate him more, we celebrate him more deeply at Christmas, but also each week we're going to see in their failings something that I hope leaves us with an ache for his peerless perfection. And so that a little bit more deeply each week as we head towards Christmas, we are longing for the coming again of the King of Christmas. Does that make sense? So this week we start with Jesus as son of, Jesus descendant of Abraham. Thanks, Holly, for reading that so well. I dare say most of you have not read this story at Christmas time before. You probably know of Abraham. He's well known. He's one of the heroes of the faith. This is not one of his all-time greatest hits. He's known as this man of radical faith. God had come to Abraham and his wife Sarah and command-invited them to follow him on a journey to an unknown destination. He's known for his radical faith, for his heart-wrenchingly deep commitment to obedience that we see in Genesis chapter 22. He's known for his house wide open and heart wide open and arms wide open hospitality that he shows to strangers, which is meant to be characteristic of the people of God throughout the centuries, and of his incredible generosity to his family and friends. These are the things that Abraham and Sarah are known for. It is with this couple that God begins his strategy of rescuing the world through working through specific people. These are the things that Abraham and Sarah are known for, but not so much in this story. In this story, Genesis chapter 20, we don't see so much Abraham's faith as his faithlessness. There's less obedience and more self-preservation, less largesse and more milksop. This is a story of Abraham and Sarah at low ebb. Let me refresh you on the way the story starts. Refresh you on the way that the story goes, in case that was the first time you'd heard it when it was read a moment ago. Abraham and Sarah are journeying out of their territory. They're in a nation-state, a sort of kingdom to the south called Gerar. Abraham realizes his wife Sarah apparently sort of has it going on and is going to catch the eye of the local king Abimelech. And so he, in all of his courage, tells Sarah, just be my sister. Play my sister. Ladies, how many of you would love to have a boyfriend or a husband like that? Like there is possessiveness that's bad, and there's possessiveness that's good, and he doesn't have the good kind. So he plays her off as his sister. She is conscripted into Abimelech's harem, and before the relationship is consummated, the Lord visits Abimelech, this king of a godless territory, in a dream and says, go get Abraham to pray for you. And Abimelech does, and he gives Sarah back to her husband, and he gives them this enormous fee, and then Abraham prays for them, and the nation is healed. That's the story, the Cliff Notes version of the story. Where I want to start here with is with a theme that I think frames the story from the very start. It crops up in verse 4. The Lord visits Abimelech in a dream, and Abimelech says to God, this king who, so far as we know, has no relationship with the God of the Bible, he protests to God, he pleads with God, will you destroy an innocent nation? God, will you have mercy on an innocent nation? I mean, as innocent as you can be while you're harem building, right? But what he means is, I did this without realizing she already had a husband. And I think if we read this without reading what came before it, it seems like it's just coming out of the blue. But had we been reading all the way through Genesis, this would ring in our ears, because a mere chapter and a half earlier, in Genesis 18, it was Abraham who was pleading this way. Abraham had a relative who lived in a nation that was known for its injustice, for its immorality, and Abraham begged God, if there are 50 righteous, 50 innocent, same word, people in that city, will you spare it, please? And God's like, yes, gladly. How about 45? If there are 45 innocent people in that city, will you spare it? Of course. 30. Will you spare it for 30? Yes, Abraham, I will spare it for 30. And each time Abraham presses into the mercy of God, and the number of righteous people on whose account the many will be spared is lowered. Each time he presses in and that number's lowered, we see the scale of the iceberg of God's mercy below the surface. He is a God of matchless mercy. And Abraham, near the end of the conversation in chapter 18, not even daring to hope that God would go so low as 10, says, how about if there are only 10 innocents? Will you spare the city for them? And God says, happily. And the rabbis have always pointed out that God didn't stop the conversation there. It's Abraham's mercy that has been plumbed at 10, not God's. And so this story, in which we see Abraham and Sarah at least Abraham, at his low ebb of faithfulness, begins with a king who apparently has no relationship with the one true God, but nonetheless who has been visited by the one true God in a dream, and he asks the question, God, will you be merciful? How merciful a God are you? What is the scale of the mercy of the one true God. I don't know, if you're listening with your Advent ears on, you might start hearing some Christmas music in that question. Let's press on. Next thing I want you to notice is that after Abimelech is visited in this dream, he's understandably sort of taken aback, and he calls Abraham into him in verses 9 and 10. And he's like, seriously? Like, who does that? Who pretends that his wife is his sister so that an otherwise well-intentioned harem-building local king conscripts her? With somebody else before. Yeah. Who does that? And if you look at the answer that Abraham gives, it's this mealy-mouthed, kind of fumbling, back foot, self-preserving, defensive answer. And we see the nature of it in verse 13. He's like, well, God has made us wander. And ever since we've been wandering, this is the plan that we've come up with. That's what he says, essentially. And the NLT puts it, go from place to place, but literally it's, since God commanded me to wander, this is the plan we've come up with. No mention of chapter 12 and chapter 15 where God promises to him, the land I am taking you to, I will give to you. You have no descendants now, but I am going to give you enough descendants that it makes astrological mathematics look simple. And the land is going to be theirs. No mention of the faithfulness and the provision and the protection of God, just God made me wander, so I came up with a plan. I wonder how often that's the way we respond when we're at the low ebb of our faith. And so Abimelech steps up here and he returns Sarah to her husband, and I love the humor in the text here. He's like, take this enormous gift and make sure that your brother knows about it. Give this to your brother, this gift of 1,000 silver pieces. I had John Rain, who's better at math than I am, run some numbers before the service. This is about $8 million in today's cold cash. It's a big gift. It's a big gift, and it's tempting to think this is hush money, or this is reparations, or the way our text interprets it, it's more as a complaint settlement. The Hebrew idiom is, here is a gift to cover the eyes. Cover the eyes. It's not so much about closing mouths as it is about closing eyes. An incredible, enormous gift to pronounce their innocence, their guiltlessness, by covering eyes. I don't know if you're listening closely, but if you're listening closely with your Advent ears on, you might start to hear Christmas music. Let's keep pressing to Abraham the prayer, Abraham as intercessor. When God first comes to Abimelech, he tells him, look, you are under this plague because of what you have done. And Abimelech says, look, I'm innocent. And God says, well, actually, I know at least your intentions, as far as the intentions of a harem-building king go, were innocent. And that's why I have spared you from consummating the relationship with Sarah. Now, here's what I want you to do. Go and ask Abraham, the prophet, to pray for you. He will pray for you. I think that's the first time Abraham gets called a prophet in Genesis. And as you can imagine, that is awkward for both of them. He's just conscripted his wife. Now go ask him to pray for you. He's just conscripted your wife. Now go pray for him. Awkward on both parts. And yet, God, in this moment of the low ebb of Abraham's faithfulness, when he's most faithless, God calls him prophet and creates an opportunity for him to pray on behalf of someone who has threatened him. That is a theme that runs right the way through the Bible. When God's people are acting their most useless, God shows up, he speaks purpose over their lives, he creates an opportunity for them to demonstrate faith, to ask him to intervene on behalf of someone who has oppressed or threatened or hurt them. We don't see Abraham pray right away in verse 6 and 7 when he's asked. It takes all the way until verse 17. Until Abraham prays. And as you might expect, the God who has showed up to warn Abimelech, the God who has prevented Abimelech and Sarah from consummating the marriage, the God who has told Abimelech to ask Abraham to pray for him, the God who has called Abraham a prophet and told him to pray, is going to be motivated to lower his ear to hear Abraham's prayer of faith, of intercession on behalf of Abimelech and the nation of Gerar, and he answers it. And it's only in the very last verse, verse 18, that we realize that the ailment that plagued Abimelech and the women of his kingdom, at least one of the symptoms was infertility. And God heals them, grants fertility. And we're left at the close of the episode sitting on this ledge, as it were, with Sarah. She's the last one mentioned in the chapter. Sarah, whose life has been marked by an aching for this very thing. Fertility, whose story has been shaped by this unfulfilled hope, who twice already at least has been promised by God that he will give her enough offspring that it makes counting stars and numbering the grains of sand on the beach an easy thing comparatively. And so she sits there, and we with her, with a view out over God's definite, miraculous intervention, a view over God's faithfulness, a view over God's provision and his answering of prayer in the past, but also with a view forward that is blocked, where we don't see how exactly or when exactly he is going to answer the promises that remain unfulfilled. And I want you, if you are a believer, an apprentice to Jesus this morning, to find in your heart what it is that you most long for. What aspect of God's making all things new do you most long for this Advent? And put the finger of your heart on that thing. Is it for justice and shalom and flourishing in our city, this city we love? Is it the restoration of your body or the body of a loved one so that it shucks off cancer and heart disease and other ailments like water off a 5-ply Gore-Tex jacket? Is it the healing of the nations? Is it the banquet with the Lamb? Is it meeting face to face the one who has rescued you? Whatever it is that you most long for that is part of God's making all things new, I want you to put the finger of your heart on that. That'll be easier for some of you than for others as we go forward through the rest of the message. The very fact that Abraham shows up in anyone's genealogy, let alone the genealogy of Jesus, means that God was faithful to his promise to Abraham and to Sarah. You see that, right? There's no way that Abraham and Sarah and even Abimelech could have imagined that the one who would one day be named the son of Abraham, the descendant of Abraham thousands of years later, that the one who was the ultimate fulfillment of the promise, that he would take the obscure, the odd, the fragmented, the jarring oddities of this little episode and rework them into the rescue of the world. But that's what he does. That's what he does. And so this question of how merciful is God is answered thousands of years later. Will God be merciful enough to spare the many on account of the righteous few? That's answered thousands of years later. When Zechariah the priest, filled with the Spirit, prophesies over the belly of his cousin-in-law, over the baby to be named Jesus in utero, and says, in him, in this one, we see the mercy of God answering his promises to our ancestor Abraham. It's in this one, in this baby about to be born, that we will see the mercy of God breaking in like the morning light of heaven, shining in the darkness, a light on those who sit in the shadow of death. That's what Zechariah prophesies in Luke chapter 1, verses 72 through 79. He sees that in this one, the faithfulness, the matchless mercy of God is made most clear. It's not about God sparing the city on behalf of the 30 righteous. It's God sparing the world on behalf of the one righteous. When he looks out and there is no one righteous, not even one, he comes among us as one of us, innocent, fully righteous, to be the one on whom the unrighteousness of the many sits. The righteous for the unrighteous, that we might be brought to God. This is the matchless mercy of God seen in the Christmas child. Or we could go on and talk about an extraordinary gift of eye-covering innocence. Some of you, some of us, I know, are plagued with guilt. There are things from your past that you know, at least in theory, have been forgiven by Jesus, and yet nonetheless, they cling to you like the contempt-filled gaze of an accuser, following you everywhere you go. That, after all, is the way we often treat one another, isn't it? I hope he never forgets what he's done to me. I hope she feels that, I hope she hurts just as deeply and just as long as I do. Though he became one of us, he does not treat us like we treat each other. That is not the forgiveness of our God. This extraordinary gift of $8 million that was to close eyes, we see in the self-giving, inordinate gift of innocence that Jesus gives us. So when God the Father looks at me, Ian McFadden, who has hurt him so deeply and hurt God's people so deeply, he sees not my guilt. His eyes are covered by the massive, glorious, extraordinary, extravagant gift of the innocence of Jesus. That's what he sees when he looks at me. That's what he sees when he looks at you. The gift of the Christmas child is an innocent, righteous life given that the eyes of God might be closed to your sin. If there's anything that ought to make our hearts yearn, ought to make them long, shouldn't it be to meet the one who has gifted us innocence? Or there's Jesus as intercessor. It's in Abraham's weakest moment that God calls him prophet and tells Abimelech to go to him and pray for him. And he prays begrudgingly out of his faithlessness, and God answers that prayer. If God will answer the prayer of a faithful, self-preserving, slimy, white lie-telling Abraham, how much more will he hear and answer the intercessory prayers of the righteous Son of God? Did you know he prays for you? That's what Hebrews tells us, that the Son of God, the Christmas child who would come into the world as the fulfillment of these promises, he prays for you. Hebrews tells us he's like a priest. He is the greatest priest ever, and he lives always, eternally, that he might perfectly petition God on behalf of you. That's what he does. Jesus prays for you. The Son of Abraham prays for you. Abraham, when pressed, prayed for the man who had threatened him. Jesus, out of his own selflessness, came into a world. We killed him. Came into the world that he might plead on our behalf. The one who spoke light into existence as easily as 2 words in the Jesus Storybook Bible. It's hello, light. Came as a fragile fetus, like one of his creatures, had to learn to speak. We put him to death, and now he lives ever to intercede on our behalf. The Son of Abraham, the Son of God, prays for you. This time of year, a lot of us are thinking about giving gifts. Some of you think hard about giving the perfect gift. Some of you think, oh, we'll just give a lot of gifts, and hopefully one of them will be the perfect one. But I want to plant a seed in your heart that now, through the rest of the Advent season, maybe you would consider giving someone the gift of your intercession, giving the gift of your prayer. Because it's in praying that I think we most actively long for the return of the King. It's in praying that we lay hold of God's promises that haven't fully been fulfilled, and we ask him by his power to winch them forward into the present. It's in prayer that we look at all of the hope, all of the shalom, all of the fulfilling that God has promised, and we ask him to make it dawn in our or there today. It's in prayer we do that. It's in prayer that we most actively long for the return of the King. And so my encouragement to you is this Advent season that you would think of someone that you might give the gift of intercession through this Advent season. If remembering to do it's hard for you, there are easy life hacks for that. Set an alarm on your clock. Wear a rubber band around your wrist. Write something on your mirror that reminds you. But get it done. Don't let forgetfulness that plagues us all be the excuse. Is there someone that you ought to pray for? Or, following the model of the story, is there perhaps a person or a people, or dare I say a party, by whom you are threatened, by whom you or those you love are oppressed, that you feel you ought to pray for? Might we, in the tradition of the people of God, pray for our enemies, that God could display his faithfulness, even at the low ebb of our own faith. That's my hope this Advent series for all of us, that we would be collectively deepening our appreciation of the Christmas child who arrived 2,000 years ago, so that we might celebrate more fully when Christmas comes, but also sharpening our longing, our active, prayerful longing for his return. So that when you're in the mall and Whitney's O Come, Emmanuel comes over the radio, or more likely you're surfing Amazon Prime and it gets queued up in your Spotify playlist, and you're singing along unconsciously, I'm hoping that when you are singing the words, O come, Emmanuel, you are remembering, but you are longing and praying, come, God, return to heal the land. Let's pray. Father, would you sharpen the ache in our hearts for the return of the King? And this Advent, would you, by the marking of the season, form in our lives more of the attributes of the Christmas child? this mercy that staggers and that goes so against the grain of our world. Would you give us boldness before your throne, because we have been given innocence, been declared guiltless because of your extravagant, selfless gift. And would you make us those who intercede like the one who intercedes and always pleads for us? It's in his name that we pray. Amen.